Video games are an inherently collaborative art form, but those collaborators don't always come from inside the companies making these major releases. In fact, sometimes it's the fans who directly influence how a game is made. Whether it's because the developers sought advice from diehards before committing to an idea, or Backlash forced their hand to change a controversial feature, fan feedback has been integral in shaping some of the biggest games ever. So with that in mind, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games that changed due to fan feedback. Number 10, Battlefield 2042 is reintroducing classes and changing map designs. Battlefield 2042 might be the most hated game in the whole franchise, and the reason it has that reputation is thanks to its disaster of a launch. Despite promising to be a comeback, the launch release was a Frankenstein's monster of a game, one that systematically stripped out the core elements that made Battlefield great in the first place. In this sequel, gone were standard classes, replaced instead by controversial specialists, essentially Overwatch-style heroes. The tight level design was chucked out for wide-open, bland spaces, and the destruction had all but been removed entirely. 1 year later though, and Battlefield 2042 has undergone a major reworking that continues to be added to, thanks to fan criticism. After initially ignoring some of the players' biggest gripes, the developers eventually relented and have announced that previously removed features such as classes will be reintroduced to the game. Likewise, the original maps are in the process of being revamped with new versions that play far better. It might be too little, too late for some, but it is evident that the devs are responding to fan feedback in some capacity. Number 9, Halo Infinite is delayed a whole year. Initially set for release alongside the Xbox Series X/S back in 2020, the fan response to Halo Infinite was so negative that Microsoft took the unprecedented move of delaying their flagship title a mere few months before its release date, no less, by a whole year. And you can see why. The gameplay that we saw in 2020 looked incredibly rough, and absolutely not of the quality everyone expected of a next-gen Halo. Fans were vocal about their disappointment, pointing towards hilarious memes like Craig to lament that Halo Infinite just wasn't on track. Microsoft fortunately heard loud and clear and delayed the game indefinitely. And while Halo Infinite might still not be where it needs to be today, can you just imagine how broken it would have been had it dropped in 2020? At least the year-long delay helped get the fundamentals right and resulted in a title that, at first anyway, was a whole load of fun. Number 8, Star Wars Battlefront 2 rips out its entire progression system. Star Wars Battlefront 2 is the game on this list that caused the biggest fan backlash. Hell, the sequel caused such a stink that it resulted in the most downvoted comment in Reddit history, and allegedly even reached former Disney head honcho Bob Iger. The biggest problem was the microtransaction system that EA and DICE implemented in the multiplayer. It certainly wasn't the first game to feature loot boxes and in-game currency, but it was the one that pushed these systems to a breaking point. Before release, fans worked out that unlocking heroes, which were available from the start of the previous game, might I add, would take tens, if not hundreds of hours of grinding, essentially forcing players to pony up money to bypass the time sink entirely. Throw on top of that a pay-to-win loot box system that gave bigger spenders better weapons and abilities, and it was just a complete mess. EA as such were forced to respond, and they tore out the progression system and over the next couple of months reshaped it entirely. The launch version of Battlefront 2 was poison, but it might never have become the genuinely stellar shooter it is today without this controversy. Number 7, Destiny replaces Peter Dinklage with Nolan North. Considering it was the first of its kind, it probably shouldn't have been surprising that Destiny's launch was as rough as it was. Blending MMO sensibilities with regular first-person shooting, Bungie's new IP was an ambitious game that buckled under its own weight. The one part of the title that fans didn't expect to be so rough though was everything surrounding the script, story, and performances. Sadly, what transformed Destiny from being a little bit disappointing into a bona fide mega meme was Peter Dinklage's role as AI companion Ghost. His bored, monotonous performance, and that's saying something coming from me, was made even worse by the lines that he was forced to spout. Yeah, everyone remembers that wizard came from the moon, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. Instead of living with the mess they'd made, over a year later, Bungie actually drafted in industry veteran Nolan North to re-record all of Dinklage's work to give the character a bit more, well, character. Number 6, Assassin's Creed Syndicate adds female playable characters. While Assassin's Creed Unity is now remembered for its glitches and horror show faces, another controversy dogged it before release. See, previous AC games had featured female playable characters, usually only in the multiplayer, but the option for co-op players to choose a different gender was removed entirely from the game prior to Unity's launch. That's questionable as it is, but the devs put their feet in it completely when they attempted to justify this omission. In interviews, they mentioned how this option was originally planned, but was eventually cut due to, quote, a lot of extra production work. In response to this, fans and journalists called BS, saying that the excuse that it would apparently double the workload was completely overblown. Now, there was nothing the studio could do for Unity itself in response, especially after the mess at launch, but the desire to see playable female characters didn't fall on deaf ears, thankfully. The next game, Syndicate, featured the option to play as a female protagonist, and it's become a staple of the series ever since, resulting in one of the franchise's strongest characters, Cassandra, in AC Odyssey. Number 5, Days Gone makes Deacon St. John more likable. Days Gone turned out to be way better than a lot of people expected, but for a long time it looked as though it was going to be a total disaster. The early trailers were rough, while a lot of the pre-release previews reiterated the same criticism, that being that lead character Deacon St. John just wasn't compelling enough. Though performer Sam Witwer was giving it his all, the material itself wasn't up to snuff. The biker was essentially nothing more than a dime a dozen post-apocalyptic anti-hero with a heart of gold. And that's fine, but it's boring. His character arc didn't help either, as Deacon was initially constructed to be purposefully unlikable, in order for him to redeem himself over the course of the story. However, fans and playtesters responded negatively to this, saying that being forced to play as an unlikable and irredeemable dude for the first 10 hours or so would simply sour us against him even more. In interviews, the devs explained that they took this feedback on, smoothed out some of his rougher edges, changed some of the lines that took particular flack, and morphed him into a character that players could actually relate to. And it worked. Deacon St. John is cool, and it's a shame we won't see any more of him. Number 4, Gears of War 3 let you decide Carmine's fate. One of the most beloved running jokes throughout Epic's original Gears of War trilogy involved the Carmine family. In the first game, players were introduced to Anthony Carmine, who lasted all of about 5 minutes before getting shot in the face. In the second game, Ben Carmine joined Delta Squad as a rookie, and for a while it looked like he might avenge his brother. Sadly, he ended up in the belly of a giant worm, torn to pieces by a bunch of critters. Fans knew that Epic were going to continue this trend and have yet another Carmine sibling in the third game, this time called Clayton, and the big question, of course, was whether or not he too was going to succumb to a tragic and kinda hilarious death. However, the devs decided to let fans in on the fun, and left it up to them to decide whether the next Carmine would make it through the game unscathed. The Fate of Carmine promo was then launched, where Xbox players could buy either a Save Carmine or Carmine Must Die t-shirt for their online avatars, and whichever side sold the most would influence the story. Fortunately as well, all proceeds went to charity, which came to around $150,000, and in the end, Clayton ended up making it out alive. Number 3, Far Cry 5's DLC was shaped by a fan survey. After Far Cry 3, Ubisoft's franchise had a bit of an identity crisis. The 80s action movie pastiche Blood Dragon released as a DLC for the third game, and everyone loved it, with many fans and critics even saying that they preferred it to the more realistic base experience. Far Cry 4 continued what 3 started, but spin-off Primal again flirted with a more imaginative setting, going back in time to 10,000 BC. After this, in 2015, Ubisoft released a poll to fans, asking them what kinds of worlds they'd want to see from future games. There were a bunch of things that they could vote on, including a spaghetti western pastiche, an island of dinosaurs, vampires, and a sequel to Blood Dragon, all suggesting the franchise was again going down a wackier route. And while these ideas didn't make it into the next numbered release, they did act as the base for its DLC. In fact, all of the expansion packs for Far Cry 5 came from ideas included in this poll, those being a zombie outbreak, a trip to another planet, and the Vietnam War, so it can be assumed that they were the ones that received the most votes. Number 2, Mass Effect Andromeda's direction was decided over Twitter. The poll sent out to Far Cry fans had plenty of different scenarios that Ubisoft wanted opinions on, but when it came to continuing the Mass Effect franchise, BioWare had a much more straightforward choice they needed to make. The third game had resolutely rounded off that trilogy, and the choice made by players at the end of that sequel changed the very fabric of the universe, so there was no way for the devs to follow up on it without picking one ending as canon, which would have disregarded the choices of so many players. Most fans then assumed that a continuation of the series would happen via a prequel, chronicling the First Contact War and the humans discovering the mass relays for the first time. That would have been a little bit limiting though, as it would have had to tie directly into what we knew from the trilogy about that period, which was a lot thanks to those absolutely chunky codex entries. Because this is the modern age then, Mass Effect director Casey Hudson simply took to Twitter and asked fans what they wanted to see from the next Mass Effect game. Though this wouldn't have been the sole reason that Mass Effect Andromeda opted to venture into a new galaxy, it certainly would have influenced the decision. Number 1, Metal Gear Solid 4 is an entire game of fan service. Every sequel following the first PS1 Metal Gear Solid game was supposed to be the last game in the franchise that director Hideo Kojima ever made. After this, MGS2 ended Solid Snake's journey on an ambiguous note, putting the focus on the player and their own meta journey rather than the in-game conflict between heroes and villains. After that, the director jumped into the past with MGS3 to focus on Big Boss's early years as a war hero, rounding off his series in a satisfying way. Or so he thought, because even though years had passed, fans still demanded to know what happened to Snake, Raiden, and everyone else following the events of the second game. Consequently, Kojima felt obliged to return to answer all of the lingering questions, as well as make good on some of the concepts that fans didn't gel with before. There's a reason then why Metal Gear Solid 4 is referred to as Fan Service the video game, and that's because it bent over backwards to explain pretty much everything about its convoluted plot, while at the same time turning the despised Raiden into a total badass ninja. And of course, that doesn't mean it's bad. I love the game, but it is undeniably a game made for fans first and foremost. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. What do you think about the way these games evolved? And are there any instances of fan feedback evolving games that I missed off here? Let me know, and while you're down there, could you please give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.